see, high profile pictures, enable waiting room. All right, so I'm going to mute you for right now, but what we do have is I've got a gentleman online with me who's going to be able to ask, or rather take any questions that you want to chat to us. We're going to open some sessions up a little bit as we go through, just so I can kind of present some of the ideas and ask you guys questions, see if I can keep you more engaged. It's going to be about an hour to an hour and 15, 20 minutes, depending upon the questions. And I'm going to send you out, or I'm going to ask you 2 or 3 questions just to kind of get a basis from the standpoint of the level of understanding. But truly appreciate you coming in. Just give us a little bit more time to allow for a couple more people to come in. All right, so I'm going to start. Everybody can still hear me? We're good. So you guys are all good. I'm going to start. You can still hear me. I had a problem earlier with another one of these presentations where kind of things didn't go very well. So I want to make sure everybody can hear me now before I start.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
I'm going to move forward then.
Perfect.
Great. All right. So the first thing is, again, my name is Ty Glover. I truly appreciate you coming in. Think Different Nation, and more specifically, Creative Juices, has been kind of like a project I've been working on for some time. It's given me really a great deal of pleasure to be able to work in it, because it's something that I think I'm naturally inclined to do, look in certain directions, but you'll get an understanding of that as we go through. So I'm going to bring up the next slide and we'll kind of transition through this one. All right, so what Think Different Nation is? First of all, Think Different Nation was an organization. I founded because I recognized the fact that we are such an incredible species. We have the ability to move mountains, to go to all ends of the 4 corners of the earth, but yet we're recognizing also that we are a species in decline. And that I'm going to put everyone on mute. Let me see. All right, we should be all on mute now. So recognizing the fact that we are also a species in decline, but yet an understanding, and we are the most adaptive species, we can accommodate, we can adjust, as Marcus Aurelius spoke of. Now, as I go through this process, I've recognized a couple things. And so I'm going to be walking through that with you. But one of the first things I want to point out to you, is a recognition that I had several years back. And this is what we're going to be speaking to right here. Now, everyone's familiar with this statement that Steve Jobs has made. Again, you can't connect the dots by looking forward. You've got to look backwards. That's where the dots connect, by looking backwards. You have to trust in something. Now, the area that I focus in on is right here. It's that special space because it's your gut, destiny, karma, life, whatever. One thing that I've always recognized is the fact that the universe is a rules-based place, which means everything within the universe operates according to a rule. Now, cause and effect would say the absence of a rule, or rather chance, is just a rule that has not been found yet. Again, everything operates according to a rule. Now, when Steve Jobs spoke about that, first of all, he spoke about you can't connect the dots by looking forward. He meant you can't connect the dots by looking forward because your experiences are from where you're pulling those dots. Therefore, you have to look backwards. This special area, as far as your gut, your destiny, life, karma, that's that specific sauce that we're going to be talking about. Because what I look at is I look at 2 specific things. I look at, or rather, I accommodate something called Neuro-Linguistics Programming. Now, right off the bat, I want to do a survey so I understand How many of you are familiar with neuro-linguistics programming? So I put a survey right here online. Are you able to see this and access this survey? See if you can go in and answer this survey, just so I can get an idea of who I'm working with. All right, I see some answers coming through. So we've got more or less somewhat familiar with it. We've got a 50-50 split so far, running. So some folks are familiar with it, other folks are not. So let me give you an idea of what neuro-linguistics programming is. So we've got a little bit of trending, more so not understanding. Neuro-linguistics programming is something that we're going to be talking about in depth because it is a structure through which I believe we process our human experience. If you think about the fact that we live through our human experiences through our 5 basic senses of sight, sound, smell, touch, taste, which means all the information that we bring into ourselves, it comes in through those 5+ senses. Now, if we're bringing in all the information that we work with through those 5+ senses, then it means that we're making decisions based on the information we receive. So if I'm hearing certain things, then I'm going to be taking that information in, I'm going to be processing it. But you have to recognize the fact that we have to look at our experiences and how we digested experiences in the past and the opinions or the emotions that those experiences created with us in order for us to be able to make a determination of this next information piece that I'm getting. We pull from that background, we make a determination of this additional information that we're getting, and then we make a decision or we create an emotion one way or the other about that. So with neuro-linguistics programming, it helps people to understand the fact that our emotions are literally tied to A, our past experiences, and B, what came from those experiences, meaning how we digested them. I'm going to give you some really great examples of exactly how that's impacted me throughout much of the course of my life. And I'm only kind of getting through that right now. But again, looking at the rules and the structures through which we operate, and as Steve Jobs spoke of, that gut, that destiny, I think there's more to it than just the way we interact with the world, our 5 basic senses. There's more of that metaphysical side of it. And if you're familiar with anyone such as Carl Jung, or even going back as far as Cosimo de' Medici, from the standpoint of his discoveries late in his life, Albert Einstein, or even Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius is considered to be one of the 5 great emperors of Rome. He was the one that was depicted in that movie, The Gladiator, where he was the emperor that Russell Crowe was speaking to towards the beginning of the movie. And the one thing that he actually is very known for is he wrote a book called Meditations. And one of his most impactful statements for me was, our actions are impeded, or rather, although our actions are impeded, there can be no impeding our intention or disposition because we can adapt, we can accommodate. The mind adapts and converts to its own purpose, the obstacle to its own acting. The impediment to the action advances the action, and what stands in the way becomes the way. Now, it's really not discussed very much about what that specific statement is, but really what that specific statement stands or speaks to is the principle of polarity, the principle of cause and effect as well. See, if you look at Marcus Aurelius, he lived about, I think it was in the year of like 179 AD after the death of Christ, and therefore he had gone through a great many trainings with respect to his upbringing. He had traveled to all throughout Greece. He had gone to Egypt, and he had been taught by some of the philosophers of that time period. And therefore, he would have had a great understanding of those common principles that go back deep into antiquity. And so his latter statement, he says, our inward power, when it obeys nature, it reacts to events by accommodating itself to what it faces, meaning our inward power automatically looks at those events and we automatically adjust to what is possible. If it needs specific, or rather it needs no specific material to do that, it pursues its own aim as circumstances allow. It turns obstacles into the fuel. Now, if you look at those Hermetic teachings, then one thing that's also very interesting about that is the fact that, one thing that's also very interesting about that statement is that if you look back through antiquity, you'll find also the Egyptians, they had a god, and the god was known as Nous. And this is more so looking at the Hermetics within the Egyptian faith or that Egyptian discipline. But The God of Nous was a God of creativity, a God of wisdom, a God of intellect, more or less. And he was the God, or rather, in their eyes, the creator of mankind. And that goes back into the whole Christian belief. Of course, we are a creation of God, but this is not really going to be discussing that. It's more so recognizing the fact that Nous, with us being created as a product of Nous, it also recognizes that we can also create as well. And with our ability to be able to create, we have just as much of that ability as Nous did because we are a creation of him. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But as I go through, I'm trying to work through some of the slides and how to best accommodate these. Let me see. Let's talk about, therefore, where all this comes from. So when we talk about knowledge and training, there's one common principle, the principle of correspondence. Principle of correspondence says that nothing comes from nothing. So if you look at the evolution of the automobile, this is a 1896, what is it, the name of it? Benz patent motor wagon. Now, this was the first vehicle that was actually produced, and they were moving towards the production of this as far as mass production. But if you notice this vehicle, it doesn't assemble or resemble anything that we're familiar with today. It was motorized, it was 3 wheels, but you had to accommodate it in different ways. They didn't have a car, therefore there was no understanding of how a car operates. They had to go and take from that which they had. So they had bicycles during that period of time. They had tricycles, so they understood the mechanics of a bicycle and a tricycle. They also recognized the fact that there were no gear shifts, there was no gas pedals, so they had to figure out where these things go, which means these first iterations of cars had knobs and tubes and everything going in which direction, because there was no common structure from which to operate. Now, the next car came along, and that was more so something considered as being the 1899 Royal Enfield. This car, again, it had 4 wheels now, but it was different as well because you had different levers on the bottom. You could control it in different ways. You now had more control. Your gas was on the left-hand side. So you literally needed to have 3 arms and 4 to be able to operate this vehicle. So it really was better, but it wasn't much better. It was something what they call subsimilar, meaning it changed from that which it was to that which it became. The next one came out in 1916. This was the Cadillac Type 53. Now, this one was the first model that had the traditional steering wheel, that had the brake pedal on the left-hand side on the floor. It had the gas pedal on the right-hand side on the floor. It had the turn signals on the right-hand side. So while it was not exactly the same that we have today, because evolution has occurred and therefore changes have been made, it still is very close to the present model that we have today. They pulled, or rather Cadillac looked at all these different types of cars back in the day to figure out which ones should we go with, which one should be the best vehicle for us to operate from. And then that's how they finally came up with the idea of the standard model that has existed for over 100 years in operation. We're moving again where we are today with driverless cars. So this is completely changing again. And they're even understanding or trying to figure out what should sound like, what should turn signals or indicators. But nonetheless, you can't get something from nothing. So if you didn't have that first vehicle, or rather the Royal Enfield that existed in 1899, you perhaps wouldn't have had the same formation in the Cadillac. If you didn't have the 1896 Benz patent motor wagon, then you perhaps would not have had that Royal Enfield that had come up earlier, because nothing comes from nothing. You need to have something from which you can gather, you can gain ideas. Okay? So let's move to the next slide here. All right, so now we're going back in a little bit into neuro-linguistics programming. One of the things that Tony Robbins does, especially with NLP, is he leverages it. He talks about, for example, the fact that we've got, one second, my slides are rolling back a little bit. He leverages NLP. He recognizes the fact that, or rather, he sees 5 specific models or disciplines that can be leveraged with neuro-linguistics programming, something called imagery training, imagining what you want, or they call it modeling, mirroring, meaning if I see someone, I'm talking to someone, I'm mirroring their patterns and therefore they're mirroring mine. If you even think about that, they say that the human facial expressions from the standpoint of husband and wives and how we look very so similar to our wives or our husbands is because we mirror. we form the same exact expressions when we're speaking or communicating to them that they form with us. And that's why the crow's feet and the lines around the face develop in the same way. And that's why ultimately we wind up looking like our spouse. At least that's what they speak of with regards to mirroring. Okay, so that's how that works a little bit with NLP, but we're going to take it to a different place. Now, NLP, so when we look at NLP, again, it looks at how we communicate, Neuro-Linguistics Programming. It was created by a gentleman by the name of Richard Bandler and John Grinder back in 1979, 1980, but they recognized the fact that A, we're mechanical beings, B, that we operate, if you were to think about it in terms of computer language, we operate according to if-then statements, and therefore everything that we do could be actually coded out into an if-then statement. But when we operate, we look at things from the standpoint of, first, the neural side of it. What is the neural side? That neural side is our 5 basic senses plus. It's how we engage the world, how we understand through our sight, through what we're seeing. We're taking that information in and we're digesting it. Or through our hearing, what we're hearing from people, what they say. The linguistic side goes into more so how we process the information that we're taking from that, the way we communicate with ourselves and from others. So in other words, we have an inner dialogue that takes place within us. We hear positive things, we think positively. We hear negative things, we think negatively. So we have that inner dialogue that's taking place, but we also express what we understand from that inner dialogue to the people in which we actually interact with. If you go into the programming side, that gets into how we are programmed to respond based on what we hear, what we've seen, what we touch. And that's, again, based on our backgrounds and our past. Now, NLP looks at it from the standpoint of the premise is our experiences direct our understanding. That's huge. Our experiences and everything that we've been through direct our understanding. So if you look at it a little bit more closely, you can look at it, for example, the common interaction. We've got 2 people here looking to communicate. What happens when we communicate? Well, what do? We have to think about what we want to say first. So we have to understand for that person, what am I going to say to this next person, which means we have to figure that out. Now, what we do is we encode that message, and we use a number of different things that take place when we're encoding a message, when we're deciding what we're going to say. The first thing is we do use deletion processes to remove background noises that are occurring around us that are not involved in our direct interaction. Therefore, it should not be involved in the decisions that we're making regarding how we're going to encode a message. The second thing is we also look at distortion. Things can be distorted by information that we're hearing as well. So we have to kind of block the distortions as much as possible so we're receiving the effective information that we're trying to convey. And most important one for me when it comes to neurocreative programming is the generalization. We are generalizing machines. Everything that we do, we generalize through our experience. And if you can imagine that, for example, if we have a loved one who maybe we've seen them in their prime and they're moving around and we're watching that loved one and nothing actually stands out. It's not until we see that loved one who may be experiencing a little bit of pain or challenge that we start to take note of the difference that we see in that loved one. But the same exact experience occurs around us all the time. We generalize that what we see today, what we understand today, what we've understood always in the past is going to be the same as that which we understand in the future. That is a generalization. It's not until we see actually anomalies or kinks in that generalization do we start to take note of what's different, what's happening here, and then we give that attention. So generalization is so important. But the memory, understanding, for example, the values, the beliefs, our purpose, that all goes into that whole question of how are we digesting the information that we're receiving? But what happens? We finally communicate that message. It goes across. That person receives that message now. That person now has to uncode what they're seeing. They've got to digest it, which means they go through a whole process of decoding, which means they've got to look at it. They've got to look at it from the verbal side. What words did you say? What was your body language like? What were your gestures like? Because they're trying to figure out how or what are you saying and how should I take what you're saying? They're also going and they're looking at it from the standpoint of, I can't even see my words, but the nonverbal side of it. We talked about the communications as far as body language. And then they're also looking at it from the standpoint of the actions. What should I be doing? How should I be responding? And this happens instantly when we receive that message because they've got to figure out I got the message in, I'm understanding it, I'm digesting it, I'm producing a response, and therefore they've got to produce that response, which goes out. They encode that message, they send it out to the person, it goes around, that person receives that message. They've got to now go and process the message that they're receiving. And this is just a continual loop that occurs. So this is basically how we operate within a world of NLP. And this is something that we're very familiar with as humans. It's this way our species operates, and it's an automatic process. But there are other things that are taking place as we're doing this. For example, looking at some of my notes again, that NLP or the neural, so let's talk about neuro-creative programming now. Neuro-creative programming, in my opinion, works differently because neuro-creative programming recognizes the fact that we don't just operate based on our 5 basic senses from the standpoint of with NLP, you're primarily focusing in on the sight, what I see and how I'm digesting the information that I'm seeing, what I'm hearing, and also what I'm possibly touching. We're very physical people. But with neuro-creative programming, we do this a little bit differently. So let me bring this slide in. With neuro-creative programming, again, we're using those same 5 basic senses. So that's, again, how we're digesting the world and digesting our experience. The thing is, we also use what's called the creative aspect. The creative aspect here is different because we're actually using those experiences to develop opportunities. And I'll talk about how we actually look for opportunities with regards to understanding our experiences around it in a second. But we create those opportunities from the experiences that we have. And then again, the programming side of it is how we're naturally programmed to respond based on the information that we receive. What I call it rather is an instinctive advantage, especially when it comes to those very areas that you are naturally inclined to go into and that you're very good when you go into those areas. Now, transitioning back, kind of still working on the flow of these slides and how I deliver them. But so let's just jump directly into this one. This is, again, kind of like the synopsis of the NLP side of things. We're looking at it, I see something, and therefore I'm going to create an opinion about what I see. And what happens when we do that? We actually primarily focus in on those 3 senses of the sight, sound, and smell. But again, with the neuro-creative programming, we look at the much larger sense collection because people operate differently. For example, you have the artists. They're going to be primarily, potentially, depending upon what art they operate within or the medium they use, but they're going to be the visual side of it. Or you're going to have the chef who's going to be the scent, the smell, the taste. It's going to be very important. Probably less so the tactile or the touch, but that's going to be important as well. Obviously, the language side or the words, not important at all when it comes to a chef because they deal with different types of senses. They lean in differently. So let's go to the next one. Here, we're talking about experiences. So now, if we're operating in a world where everything that we learn and everything that we operate in come from the experiences that we have, then unless we have experiences, we're not going to even know how to operate. We're not going to know how to form a conclusion. I see I've got a text in here, so let me see what the message could be. Very blurry slide. Let me see. What can I do about that? My apologies. I'm going to make sure that I can change that on the next slide, but I really don't know what I can do about it right now. I'm going to put this out as well. So I'll put it out on YouTube. You'll be able to see it that way. And I will work on those slides. It may not be in line with the actual verbiage itself, but I'll work on getting some better slides out there. So when it comes to looking at who we are as humans are concerned, look, we've got our first experiences. That's the immediate family. When we're first born, we've got our whole world is operating directly around our immediate family. More so when we're getting older, we're starting to go out, we're starting to see that immediate surroundings around us. So as you're seeing, as we're getting older, our world is developing out and we're capturing more and more experiences as we get older and older. But there's another process that's taking place here because we really have to understand how do we absorb information. It's not as formulaic or it's not as easy as you would think. For example, we rather capture that information in the form of delta waves when we are, for example, from 0 to 2 years old. My wife has been a babysitter for a number of years. She's of Latin descent. She was born, her first language is Spanish. And the children that she works with, typically she gets them between 3 months, 4 months old. and she'll work with them for several years. But these children are multilingual. They may be speaking two or three different languages because she's working with them primarily on Spanish. But the way they're learning the language is they're absorbing it in. It's not as if they're having to work on it. There's more or less, they say it's a dream-like state, more or less like we're sleeping or just waking up. It's that lucid dreaming state that a child of that age operates in, and therefore they can collect that information and absorb it so easily. From the standpoint of getting into the next wavelength, that's the delta and that's the alpha wave. So as we're moving up, we're moving into 2 to 6 years old for the actual, what is that? That was the theta wave system, therefore deep relaxation, mental imagery. There's not a lot of conscious processing that's taking place with children between 0 to 2 or 24 months, as well as 2 to 6 years old. They're just absorbing the information. That's the most effective time to learn. The challenge with that, however, is that they're not using any type of filter on what they're learning. They're simply absorbing the information in, taking it in, and therefore that which they're learning may not necessarily be correct. It may not be necessarily in alignment with their best interest or the greater good interest as far as that is concerned. They simply learn from pulling that information in, literally taking it in. You could more or less say they're absorbing that information in. It's not until we get to around 6 to 12 years old, where it becomes more relaxed and they're starting to use that cognitive conscious power. And then as adults, we know how we're operating within a delta wavelength. So let me see, I think we have another text coming in. So as we move through those different age groups, we're also learning differently and we're developing understandings in different ways. But what does that mean for us? I've always used to think about the fact that, well, let me share that story with you in a second. So we're moving through, but there's one other very big point that I had to recognize much later in life. If you're familiar with a gentleman by the name of Howard Gardner presented a concept of multiple intelligences. Now, this blew me away because it really helped me to confront some challenges that I had dealt with. But the principle of multiple intelligences recognizes the fact that we don't just understand our existence or our world through those logical mathematical structures, meaning tests that we've all taken from way back in the day, and we formulated our opinions based on possibly how we got with respect to our scores. But Howard Gardner recognizes there are 9 different types of intelligence that we all actually leverage. Some of us are going to lean into more of one than the other, but it's not this structured way. And if you've been grown up throughout your life thinking in terms of logical mathematical skills, which is what's being tested on those IQ tests, and perhaps your score wasn't as high as you would have liked to have been, then that's going to confront you. That's going to impact potentially your self-esteem, your psyche, your consciousness, and your beliefs towards what you can accomplish and who you can become. Well, it was Howard Gardner that really started to elucidate that for me, and recognizing the fact that I don't necessarily have to align around what this specific structure is of intelligence, that there's multiple intelligence that we can leverage. For example, the bodily kinetics is the first one he spoke of. It's that physical person. It's the person who understands their body. They understand how it works, how it operates. Let me check for text messages real quick. Will you be touching base on the impact of childhood trauma? You know, I can speak to the impact of childhood trauma on my side. That's not really where I want to go, because that really leans more so into the neuro-linguistics programming side. And mine kind of moves into the creative side of the neuro-creative side of the how do we interact with our world. So, but I do have one example that I can actually point out with regards to that childhood trauma. The second one, for example, he spoke of, again, this was Howard Gardner. He spoke of the naturalists. Anyone who goes into the Amazon or into any indigenous community, you will see people who understand their environment better than anyone else who would enter into that environment. You can definitely see that these folks know the fauna, the flora, they understand the skies, they understand the trees, they understand what the rivers are going to do based on their history of what they've seen in the past and their collective consciousness of what that community has seen. So no one can say, or rather you can take a person who's a naturalist and you can give them an IQ test, and they're probably not going to do very well at that IQ test because they're not structured to understand the way in which an IQ test will grade them or test them. Another one, for example, would be the spatialist. The spatialist could be the artist, could be the pilots, people who understand the structure and the dimensions of space itself. And they can recognize, for example, the clarity between possibly distance out, and anyone who's, for example, possibly the hunters or people who are pilots would be very strong in this area because they've developed the skill in those directions. If we go and look at the mathematical logic, we talked about that with the IQ test. The musicians, it seems like they're just born. People are naturally inclined, seems like right out of the womb, to lean in certain directions. And there's a story about that as well that we can touch base with later. But nevertheless, we all have certain inclinations that take us in a direction where I believe we're inclined to go. The linguistic side, people who are very good with language, they can process the information they're hearing. They're very also good with communicating to others. We've got the interpersonal, the intrapersonal. We've got the existential, that person that believes in deeper order, deeper powers. Now, I did a test, and I invite you to schedule some time with me free of charge, and we'll walk through this test with you as well. But when I walk through mine, trying to understand and get a real gauge as to where I might be, this is, again, very non-scientific test, but I found out and recognized the fact that I'm very good with math. Earlier on, I was not as good. I think I was afraid of math, but I'm very good with math. I'm naturally inclined to at least be inquisitive and inquire in those directions. Bodily kinetics, I'm not a physical guy, or excuse me, the naturalist, I'm not that outdoors type of guy. It's something that I've never really inclined to. While I do cook and I use natural additives into my ingredients, I'm not necessarily that naturalist type of person, but I'm sure you're going to find something that you're going to be able to classify as being yourself. The bodily kinetics, not strong there. I've never been a physical person from the standpoint of an athlete. I'm deep into the existential side of things. I'm deep into understanding, or at least wanting to understand, the bigger order and the bigger structure of things. When I look at the interpersonal, I'm very low with interpersonal. My ability to be able to walk into a room and understand how to use, or what the effective language that I should be using in any given situation, is challenging. I mean, for example, I used to go out with friends of mine back in the day, and they may go to a strip club or whatever, and I'm sitting there with them, and I have no understanding of a conversation I should be having with this young lady. I mean, she's not going home with me. I'm there, I'm sitting here, and I'm talking to her about politics because I have no other clue as to what to talk to her about, because it just hasn't come up in my realm. Meanwhile, my friends, they were very conversant. They were able to kind of shoot the breeze and everything else, and I'm not good in that space. Next one, we can look at the intrapersonal. I'm very good at the intrapersonal, understanding myself, understanding how I'm operating and ways by which I'm operating, and possibly, to mention that point of the past traumas, things that have impacted me in the past that are now still possibly determining the course of my life. So I'm very good on the interpersonal side. From the standpoint of look at the next one, the musical, I'm not musically inclined. I don't even listen to music in my car. I will typically listen to an audiobook. Lastly, looking at the linguistic side of the house. So, the linguistic side. I'm pretty good at linguistics. I rate it myself in that way. But again, we all have a structure and way by which we're naturally inclined to go or think or operate. And that's what I focus in on, our natural inclinations. And that introduces the next topic of what I would call instinctive advantages. Again, we all operate, I believe, according to those 9 different types of intelligences, but I think we also all have directions or ways in which we are naturally inclined to go. An instinctive advantage is what I call it to it. Now, I know what mine is. My instinctive advantage, for example, consists of 3 primary parts. And mine would be active observance. This isn't necessarily just mine, however. I think this is the mindset of any type of a person who is a creative type of a person. You're always looking to create whatever your medium is, whether you are the artist or whether you're the chef or you're the physical person in bodily kinetics. We all create. And that first thing that we do, that we look to create using those 5 basic senses in different ways, I believe, is active observance. And I'm going to walk through that in a second. The second one, experimental curiosity. And then the third one is what I call connective assemblance. These are the 3 primary pieces, I believe, that the creative mind leverages when it creates. If you look at what that really represents, that active observance type, I continuously leverage all five senses to identify and observe how they break from the atypical, to take note of the details of that experience. Now, that's big. I mentioned the fact that we generalize our experience. And as we're generalizing our experience, typically we will break out things. Things become not important to us. So you're looking here, you're looking at the experience itself. And what we do is we will observe that experience. And what we next do is we will interpret it. What do I take from this experience? What does it mean for me? How do I understand it? And then we go and we make a generalization. And then typically we don't consider it. We move on. The average person, when they're looking at those different situations around their lives through the five basic senses that they may have attracted their attention through, we generalize that experience and we move past it and we discount all those points. And that's something that we've done all of our lives. I think we're typically naturally inclined to either generalize and move through and discount most of that which we see around us, or we lean into it. We find something that's of curious. So for example, here's that one picture where you can see something in the background looking for patterns, and you can see patterns there and you can detect things. Your eye is looking and finding it, but may not necessarily be able to quickly discern. So you're seeing, again, first picture showing a hunter standing in a tree, looking down. Our eyes will naturally, again, try to break out and find patterns that it may be familiar with, but wearing camouflage, it's very difficult to see those patterns, but that's the way we operate. If you think about, for example, the way a deer walks into a field, possibly, it will use its senses to be able to understand whether that field is safe to enter or not. It will go and it will use a sense of smell, and it will smell for anything that it can detect as being possibly abnormal to them, not typical to what their situation is. If they find something that smells not typical, they probably won't go into that space because it represents a danger since it's not normal to them. The same thing from the visual side of it, from the hearing side. We generalize our experience, and that's what I refer to by generalizing experience. Let me give you one example of that. And this is probably one of the opportunities or the reasons in which I first really started to recognize the fact that these patterns exist when we operate. I got married in 2016 to my now wife, and she's from the Dominican Republic. And I would have a tendency to go down and visit her into DR, and we go to some of the different areas. This particular picture was taken in what's called the colonial zone in Dominican Republic. It's directly in Santo Domingo. It's proper, the city itself. And this building, it's more beautiful than the picture that I took, but the building was built in 1490, I think, 6, by the son of Christopher Columbus. And if you look at it, it doesn't really look all that interesting. But something that I noticed in this picture that I could not take away, I could not just walk away from examining it further. When I was looking at this building, I started to notice, and you may not be able to see it as clearly in this picture, but up in the right-hand side or up in the left-hand side window here, there's a peak that exists directly in that building itself. It's a peak that exists right in this window. And when you look across all the other windows on the right-hand side, there was no peak. This one was the only one that had that gable with the peak itself in the center. And I asked my wife, why is that? Obviously, she wouldn't know. This thing was built back in 14 something. So she wouldn't have known, but it just grabbed my attention. I became fixated on it, wondering why was it that that window right there was the only one that had that peak, whereas all the other windows going across had no peak. And I started to recognize that one. See, we have a tendency, again, to fixate on things, or at least I believe that creative mind will fixate to try to get an understanding of what it is. They try to make sense of it. The more I started looking at this and coming home and then trying to research a little bit, again, I fixated. But the more you come back and you look at it, I recognize the fact that 1492, 1493, that whole period of time when Columbus was coming to the New World, what else was happening at that period of time? If you think about it, the Moors had also just been vanquished from Spain after 700 or 800 years of control of most of Spain. They had just been vanquished, which means you've got a Muslim community, greatly Muslim community, that's dispersing. Many of those Muslims actually jumped on the ship with Columbus in his subsequent voyages, went over to the New World, and they were involved in building some of the buildings that were being built. in the New World, in Santo Domingo in this situation. And you can look in here in Cordoba and you can see, this is Cordoba in Spain, and you can see some of the peaks that are existing within the structures that they have there. It was part of their common thing of adding in the adornment. And when you've got these early buildings that were being built in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, there was no architect necessarily structuring it. You just had these artisans that came over for the ride and they were looking for work. So they would build. But to make the connection was very important for me. See, I think that's what the creative mind does. We go through a series of processes and analyzing. And again, most people, we will generalize and then we will dismiss consideration and not even take it any step further. But what I think the creative mind, this is just, again, talking about the asymmetrical identification, where we dismiss considerations as being not important, not relevant. But it's that creative mind that I think goes through that extra process of fixating on what they see. See, the fixation is so important, especially if you have children or kids, understanding what are you seeing and why is it, and coming up with your own understanding of the reasoning for what you're seeing. For example, when you see something and you're looking at it and you're breaking it apart and you're trying to figure out what it is, how does it work, why is it there, then typically we don't necessarily have to find an answer to those questions. I think for that creative mind, the most important thing that the creative mind does is they create their own answers. When you're solutionizing and looking at these situations, and you're trying to find your own answers, and then you're creating your own answers to that question that you're asking yourself. Again, it doesn't matter whether in fact it's the correct answer or not. The fact that you're walking through the process of creating your answer, meaning you're solutionizing. And when it comes to thinking differently, if you're thinking about it from that standpoint, if you're coming up with your own answers to a question that you're raising for yourself versus the other people that may have created the idea in the first place, automatically you're thinking differently, you're creating new answers or new solutions to problems that may have existed that may be completely different from that which was created from the other person who created the first solution. Remember, our experiences are from that which we pull to create our ideas. And so therefore you are automatically inherently going to or will have had different experiences from anyone else who has existed in the past. And therefore you will automatically create your own solutions or answers to those questions that will be different from anyone else that has come before you. It's not possible for it to be the same unless you're following their path. So that's the importance of fixating and developing those reference points, capturing your mind and understanding what it is, and then registering it. And then what happens is we create a reference point in our minds. That's something that we understand in that specific process of how that specific thing works in that specific time. And then we walk away from it and we dismiss it. And we don't have to think about it anymore, but we've stored it into our subconscious mind and we've moved on with life. So the next process that we walk through, so we just talked about active observance and how we actually absorb the information around us and create those reference points in our subconscious mind. The next part I call experimental curiosity. Now, experimental curiosity is to continuously question the atypical with the goal and the objective of understanding the reasons for the differences. You're leveraging your servants. Now, that's an important piece. If you're familiar with a gentleman by the name of Rudyard Kipling, this gentleman lived in the turn of the century, 1865 to 1936, but he was an English journalist and he was also a writer. And he had several books that he'd written back in that period of time. He's also the Jungle Book. You're probably familiar with that book. But the one thing that I think he wrote that was so important for me was, and I'm going to read this. I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I know. The names are what and why and when and how and where and who. I send them over land and sea. I send them east and west. But after they've worked for me, I give them all a rest. I let them rest from 9 to 5, for I'm a busy then, as well as breakfast, lunch, and tea, for they are hungry men. But different folks have different views. I know a person small, she keeps 10 million serving men who get no rest at all. She sends them abroad on her own affairs. From the second she opens her eyes, 1 million house, 2 million wares, and 7 million wise. Now that was Rudyard Kipling saying. He keeps his serving men or his serving agents, and I call them flight attendants. But that's truly what we leverage when we come up to a situation, and we're always asking the questions of the whys, the whats, the whens. There are thousands of different ways in which we can ponder any given situation. Again, creating additional reference points of our observations. And all these become stored in our subconscious mind because we're questioning what we're seeing and we're trying to figure out answers to that. And our brain just doesn't stop operating once we move away from that view. We just simply move on, but the process still continues on within that fixation. We're always looking for different connections to connect the pieces together in our subconscious mind as well. Let me move on to the next slide. So as we're going through that process, once we actually go through experimental curiosity and we're always continuously asking those questions, the last one I believe is what I call connective assemblance. And that's to use one's servings to search for reference points so you can get connected and create solutions to challenges within your sphere of influence. Now, when it comes to that specific point itself, again, now we're using those reference points that we've all been storing throughout our past, our history, and everything that we've examined in the past. And now that we're actually also asking more conscious questions of what I'm seeing, why am I seeing what I'm seeing, and how is what I'm seeing operating, then we're also now asking those different questions of the hows, the whens, I wonder whys. But here's where we start to really pull all those different pieces together. Where's the next one at? So through that process, again, we're working with those different reference points. We're asking all these additional information or questions, and then we're getting into that novel idea that comes from all the accumulation of the reference points that are stored in the subconscious mind, as well as all the different attendants that we're using, that we're sending out in the world, pondering the questions of why, what, when, where, and how. And so when we move through this process, here's the reason, or here's the way through which I believe we actually develop it. One thing I recognized early on is and I shouldn't be necessarily displaying this, but one thing I recognized early on is I recognized the way I operate. I recognized the fact that I've had numerous different ideas, but those ideas came from certain things. In other words, I was always in a situation where I had an experience and it led me to one thing or another. For example, one of the first companies that I created was a company called Preserving Sentiments. And this company was a company that kind of came out of first of all, to give you a little background about this one. This was a company that came out about 2006. And it was the idea, well, first of all, I just had my daughter. She was my first. I'm recognizing the fact that here I am 30 something years old, some older, which means that I'm probably not going to be able to see her throughout her entire passage as far as much later on in life, because I started much later. Also, my parents won't be able to really see her. But wouldn't it be cool, or why can't I, or what if I could find a way to know where she's going to be at any given part or point in her life, and being able to send her a message, a letter or something to communicate, I know where you are and I know what you're dealing with and I know how life is at perhaps this point in your time, maybe in your 30s, transitional period, 35 transition, but understanding where you are and then writing you a letter to be able to communicate with you to let you know I got your back. And these are some of the lessons that I would have given to you if I were there with you. So that was the first part of what we called preserving sentiments. But then that was about going and figuring out, how do I stay connected with my children? But then the opportunities started coming, because if you recognize the fact that if we're able to actually go and use actuarial tables and look at taking in money today, money that people are going to give us today to buy roses for their children or whatever type of product they can buy for their children over X number, 10, 15, 20 years into the future, then that gives us the ability to be able to take those dollars and grow those dollars throughout the period of that time. So therefore the roses can be even grown in South America or whatever we're going to be sourcing. We have a great deal of time to plan for those things and therefore deliver those to that person in the future. We've got great tracking abilities nowadays, so therefore it's not difficult to find them, but you can see the reasoning where that idea came from. Another idea that I kind of had more recently, and this kind of came back in 2014, this is what I call Christopher. And it emerged out of the first ride that I took in being a Uber or a Lyft driver. First time I jumped in the car, I'm in Philadelphia, I go down into Center City area, and I'm sitting on the side, on the curbside, and I'm waiting for this fare to come. I'm waiting for people to come and jump in my car. And next thing you know, the door opens. And someone opens the door, as a matter of fact, both sides, and these two guys get in. Now, these guys did nothing wrong. They were fine. They operated the way they should have operated as far as being Uber passengers. But it freaked me out beyond belief to have someone just open my door and I didn't see them advance on me and just jump into my car and get in the back of my car. I recognized immediately the vulnerability that existed from the standpoint of having someone in your car sitting behind you. And so Christopher was an idea that I came up with back in, again, about 2014, where it was just simply an app that was on your phone and would allow you to use a safe word. If in fact you felt threatened for any given reason, you use a safe word, it would actually call in the police department, 911. It actually starts recording the video on the phone. So you're capturing images of what's going on in the car. It's communicating a message to the people in the car saying the fact that, alert's been triggered, and then it brings in the police dispatch to have the conversation directly. So it's giving that person an opportunity to get out the car before anything escalates to a higher level, de-escalate the situation. That's where Christopher came from. It came from a situation dealing with a fear for safety in that situation. One additional idea I just want to present to you is something that I called invest out. Now, back in 2011, I went through a divorce, a very challenging divorce, where I was looking at having to liquidate all my property, having to liquidate all assets. And I recognized the fact that I live in a beautiful Victorian, 1892, in this house. This home is 2 stops away from the mass transit line, train line into Philadelphia, 1 stop away from the trolley line, 2 stops away from the bus line, 3 blocks away from the main thoroughfare that has over 10 restaurants and all the shops and all the dining. So I recognized I had an asset, but I also understood the fact that the offers that were coming into me from the standpoint of wholesalers or flippers were 1/3 of what I should have been offering. And they were able to offer that because they knew I didn't have a choice. They knew I was in a vulnerable situation. I would have had to sell that house. The house needed a lot of work, and therefore they were taking advantage of the situation. I understand what they were doing, but nonetheless, they were taking advantage of my difficult situation. So what I came up with was Invest Out. It's a company whereby people can go and they can take their home and they can upload their home into the portal. Homeowners, for example, you upload your home into the portal and then you say, how much I will sell the home for today if you want to buy from me directly. B, how much the home could sell for if it were fully renovated. You can get that information from a realtor, from a contractor, more so from a realtor. Also, how much I want from that increased value. If I'm going to let you take my house, not buy it, but I'm going to let you partner with me, you can renovate my home, you can add value to it, and then we share in that increased value, then that means you as an investor no longer have to look for homes. The homes are directly available in the portal. You can partner with me and you don't have to buy my home, which means there's a whole lot of other costs that are avoided from being able to partner. So looking at this situation which was a model of mine, very similar to my home, before renovation value, $150,000. That was what was being offered for the home. Home renovation itself would have cost about $150,000 still. So you're talking about a total drop into that home for an investor of $300,000. But they sold the home for $579,000 once it was fully renovated, which means that if they would have partnered even on a 50-50 deal with that homeowner, then that homeowner would have made an additional $132,000 on a 50-50 split of that profit. That investor would have made a clear $152,000 or $132,000. Plus, they would have gotten their money back from the original investment, which means they still would have made an ROI of 83%, which is very high, considering they typically look for about a 40% ROI is a good justification for a flip. So this was just a model that would remove the actual wholesalers from the process, that would let the investors work directly with the homeowners. They add the value in, the home is flipped or the home is renovated. The homeowner sells their property, and when the property is sold, then the investors get their money back. That was the way this model works. And the actual portal is available directly today online on investout.net if you want to take a look at that and see what it is. But that was one of the ideas that I'd had back in around 2017 that I was working with. Now, here's the thing with these ideas, though. Now, let me go to the next slide. So here's the thing about these ideas. These ideas came from 2 ways. Ideas, I believe, always come from 2 different origins. They come from a need to either minimize risk, You're in a situation, going back even to the caveman, you have to minimize the risks that you're dealing with today, such as that tiger is coming into the cave and you've got to kill that. You've got to minimize that risk. But then what do you do after you kill the tiger? You eat the bloody tiger. You maximize the opportunities that exist. Now, I believe that for any idea that has ever come out, it's always been about minimizing the risk or the challenge that I'm dealing with, and therefore next, maximizing the opportunity that I see that's been presented to me. So if we look at these ideas, for example, going back to this one, preserving sentiments. This was an idea that came out of childbirth. My wife had her first child. I was at an advanced age. I was older, recognizing there were key trends taking place within the market. Daniel Burris would call them hard trends, which means baby boomers. Baby boomers were transitioning. I think during this period of time, this is around 2008, 2007, but during that whole period of time, the baby boomers started to retire from their jobs. 77 million of them, 10,000 a month were retiring. Therefore, it represented a good opportunity. Plus, I also had knowledge of formulas. I can go and jump into Excel and I can create any type of formula to figure out what the numbers could look like. But I also had idea of website design since I work in the IT field. I also could do just a little bit of coding, but I could figure out based on my role being the functional person within the IT side, I could figure out what are the if-then statements and what is the logic that I need to do to create this website itself. So while I could not do the writing of the website, this gave me an opportunity to maximize an opportunity from the standpoint of the transitioning, and you see how the experience had occurred. Second one, Christopher. Christopher came again. That one was about minimizing the risk to safety. But as you can see, once you minimize the risk to safety, it also translated into maximizing the opportunity that existed. I was worried about safety, loss of control, but I also had app development. The app was actually there available. So I knew about app development. I knew I could also tap into the resources that were available at the time. For example, you look at guru.com was a resource you can go in there and you can hire those resources. I think Virtual Worker was available back in 2008. So all these different applications or sites where you can go and hire labor, they've been available for a while now. And I was always working to leverage those. So we have a question. Let's see if I can answer this one. Thank you very much. Truly appreciate you for coming in. Definitely understand, Colleen. So that was the second one. The third one, let's look at this. Maximizing opportunity, invest out. Invest out came from one of the most difficult situations I had ever faced in life, that divorce. And I'd say it was level 5. And I had to minimize the risk of having everything taken from me. And then I recognized the fact that, well, wait a minute, I don't necessarily have to sell my house. I can flip my house. And then thinking about I can flip my own house translates into, well, why don't I help other people flip their houses? But all these things are happening based on one common theme. These are all experiences that I was going through and helping me to get an understanding of situations or opportunities that were presenting themselves to each other. So I have just a couple more slides I want to walk you through before, because I don't want to keep you too long. And then we're going to open this up for a little bit of questions. So yeah, this is a good break point as well. Let me see. So let me ask you a question. How many are familiar with Carl Jung? I mentioned him earlier on. And let's see if I can do a poll question on Carl Jung. I probably can't. So if you're not familiar with Carl Jung, I believe he is part of that metaphysical process. Remember, I talked about when it comes to creativity, there's 2 types of things that are taking place. I think the first one is the neuro-linguistic side of it, or rather I refer to it as being the neural-creative side of it. And that's the mechanical side. That's the mechanical aspects of how do we as humans take in information using our 5 basic senses. Carl Jung introduces the metaphysical side of this whole journey that we're on, and recognizing the fact that it's more than just the way by which well, let me give you a little bit more background on him. This gentleman, he was a psychologist. He was in the era of Sigmund Freud. As a matter of fact, he was a contemporary of Sigmund Freud. They were good friends and they had a falling out later on in life. But Sigmund Freud wanted Carl Jung to actually take over the whole structure of psychoanalytics back in the day. And Carl Jung chose a different direction. And we're going to talk about that in the next class. But This is kind of where an example of the whole metaphysical process comes from, because as we're taking in that information, we talked about the actual process of alchemy. An alchemic process is something that Carl Jung believed in seriously, because he focused in on Hermetic teachings, and he focused in on the recognition of the fact that when we go and we allow our conscious mind to align with the subconscious mind, then that's when these incredible things are occurring. It's just through sitting back. It's not a matter of automatically just looking at the conscious and thinking, pulling from what we have. When you're tapping into the subconscious, that's where it's pulling from those reference points. And through that contact with that subconscious mind and the connection with those reference points, he referred to it as something greater comes, something unique and very different, and something that you could not have planned for comes out of that process. He calls it a process of active imagination. And it's the process by which we create the new ideas. And so this on the next class is really where we're going to be leaning into and starting to have more of a discussions about the metaphysical side of how all these different things to come together. So right now, I'm going to unmute your microphones. I'm going to give you an opportunity to be able to ask any questions for a little bit as we kind of complete and finish out things, finish out the program for today, just being respectful of your time. So let me see, unmute. So let me ask, how many questions that you guys may have out there so far? Can I answer any questions for you? And you should be unmuted, so you should be able to unmute yourself and speak directly within your mic. Are you able to unmute? Or do you want to chat a question if you have one that way? Okay. All right, so well, I don't want to hold you much longer today. I'd love to be able to get into a dialogue and kind of explain some of these things in a little bit more detail, kind of explain how it's working at least as well with, we're going to talk about Carl Jung in the next, as a matter of fact, in 2 weeks from now, in the next session at 10 o'clock in 2 weeks from this Saturday, we're going to walk into the next aspects of the metaphysical side. And I believe how that aligns with neuro-linguistics programming to create what I believe is neuro-creative programming, and therefore helping us to get a better understanding of how we communicate. But what I'm going to say to you today is thank you for coming in. You can always come to my to the sessions, and you can always book some time and we can sit and talk. I typically will dedicate 2 hours for any discussion, because you really can't have a discussion for anything less than 2 hours. But you know, schedule some time with me if you're interested in learning more on an individual note. And again, in 2 weeks, we're going to walk through and kind of dig deeper into the whole episode of the metaphysical side of how we process our creative experiences. Thank you again for coming in today, and I will talk to you in 2 weeks. Look forward to seeing you back. We have one more question. Oh yeah. Also, what was just communicated, what was just sent out was a link. If you're interested in scheduling any time for a conversation, just to get more of a gauge, then please feel free to leverage that link, and we'll have a conversation directly. All right. Cheers. Have a great Saturday for the rest of your day. Take care.